Hey there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Jewelry Resellers podcast. I'm your host, Desiree, and of course, I am your jewelry reselling bestie. Today, we're going to talk about how to authenticate higher end luxury pieces of jewelry. Now, as we discuss this today, keep in mind that I am fully aware that most of us are not trying to become authentication experts or professional jewelry appraisers, but I do get the question quite frequently where people will ask me, how can I figure out what is real, what is authentic? And so we're going to kind of do a deep dive on that today. So that way you have a good idea of what to look for, maybe some things that you may want to learn about as it relates to figuring out if your jewelry pieces, especially your higher end pieces, are authentic. And so we are going to cover as much as I can share as it relates to this topic because I have been doing research on this for the past week. And let me tell you, it's very overwhelming. But as jewelry resellers, we don't have to, take on this major responsibility as it relates to our business, but we do want to be more than I guess what someone would consider like average knowledge as it relates to this. Okay, so I'm going to share with you everything I've learned, and I am going to provide some other resources in case you want to research this further on your own. But don't worry, I'm going to make it as simple as possible. And I'm going to give you some tips that I think will help you be less intimidated by higher end pieces because I know I've talked to a lot of jewelry resellers who say they're just nervous, when they get a piece, maybe in a bulk lot or maybe in a jewelry jar or something like that. They get nervous, listing pieces because they're worried about, is it authentic? Or they just are nervous because if it turns out it looks like everything is as it's supposed to be, a lot of resellers get nervous because these are higher priced items, and so we worry about all the things that come along with that. All right, so before we get started on today's topic, I always like to remind you to head on over to the website, which is jewelryresellerspodcast.com. Now, this website, it's been kind of, going through its own changes, but I do have a lot of valuable information for you there. You can join our newsletter and get a copy of the 20 best-selling vintage jewelry brands that I think all resellers should know. You can also listen to all of the past episodes of the podcast, and I also have some blog posts there. I have some resource links, and I also have some links for further education as it relates to learning about vintage jewelry and how to sell vintage jewelry online. So, like I said, if you want to check any of that out, just head on over to the website. And again, that is jewelryresellerspodcast.com. All right, so let's go ahead and focus on today's topic because I think, like I said, when I first started my jewelry reselling business, I actually started with higher end fine jewelry pieces because that was what I had in my personal collection. I don't know if I've shared that. I think I've shared that on the podcast that when I started selling my own personal jewelry pieces, and a lot of it was higher end stuff. And so I knew it was authentic, thank goodness. But that's kind of how I started. So I've always felt comfortable selling higher end pieces, but that doesn't mean it's been easy for me or that I always find these types of pieces. But you will come across them, and sometimes you will come across them at a thrift store, at a yard sale, at an estate sale, or maybe you have a collection like I did, and you just realize it's time to part with it. All right, so let's talk about how to authenticate high value fine jewelry. And of course, I have my notes in front of me so I don't get off track because that happens quite a bit. All right, so let's start with the authenticity. When it comes to authenticating high value fine jewelry pieces, it does take specialized knowledge. All right, and you want to be well versed not only in learning how to appraise the nuances of gemstones and metals, but you also want to understand some of the historical aspect of the jewelry pieces, and sometimes learning about the design and the materials as well. All right, so again, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed or intimidated like you have to be an expert or you have to have a degree in art, history, and design. But again, we just need to be a little bit more knowledgeable than the average person. And that is enough to give us an edge, when we're outsourcing or when we are deciding whether or not we want to look at a piece, further, if we want to, maybe spend the money to have it professionally appraised. Okay, so one of the things that you want to understand is looking for what I've said before as it relates to jewelry is really examining the piece up close and looking for signatures and hallmarks and stamps. That's always going to be the first indicator about your particular piece of jewelry. Now, remember, not all fine or high-end jewelry is marked, but that's always going to be the first thing that we want to examine when we are studying a piece, when we are considering a piece, or when we come across something. We want to look and see, are there any indicators that this piece could be something special, right? So hallmarks are the official stamps that identify the metal type, purity, and sometimes the region of a piece. They help determine whether the piece is actually antique or vintage and whether it was crafted in an area that coincides with the designer in question. All right, so for example, a Cartier piece stamped with an eagle head hallmark indicates that the item was made in France. So this is something that I just learned. All right, so you want to look at the quality of the stamp or the marking or the signature as well, because remember, those can be faked too. I'm sure we have all seen that, especially on Tiffany pieces. There's a lot of those fakes out there. And so we want to really study and look closely at the actual signature or the hallmark or the stamp itself. All right, so you want to look at the quality of the engraving and whether or not it is consistent with other examples that are known to be authentic. And again, you can just do a search online. Sometimes there are websites that will help you authenticate, certain pieces. I know there's quite a few YouTube videos that also will teach you what to look for and how to determine whether or not the piece you have is valid. All right, so you want to look for the correct font, the correct placement, and also the correct selection of various details. Okay, so always we're going to start with looking at signatures, hallmarks, stamps, and markings. Okay, now the other thing we want to consider is iconic designers. Now, remember, we're focused on higher end, high value jewelry pieces. And if you're familiar with certain designers, then you will recognize their pieces simply at first glance. Okay. So, creations by celebrated jewelry designers, such as David Webb, Aldo, I think it's Sapolo. Or Sapulu. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. These are desired and highly valued, not only because of the designer, but also because of the fine craftsmanship on display within their pieces. All right, so you can actually kind of look at the details of the design, like the depth of the enamel, the technique used to create or to assemble the particular piece. All right, and so these are things, again, that are going to come to you over time as you build up your knowledge. Like I said, you'll be able to recognize these pieces right away. You also want to be familiar with the design period. All right. Now, this is something that I think all of us are learning and continuing to learn as we get more comfortable, studying jewelry, as we get more solid in our business and the information that we are using in order to determine the types, of pieces that we're looking to sell. And so, if a fine jewelry piece belongs to an influential or an iconic period in design history, such as Victorian, Art Deco, mid-century modern. A higher valuation is usually warranted in these types of pieces. But again, it's learning how to recognize these different eras as it relates to jewelry design. All right, so this is very important when we're trying to authenticate the signs and maybe some of the indicators from the period, as opposed to reproductions or designs inspired by these past decades. All right, because we're seeing a lot of that flood the market right now, where there's a lot of recreations inspired by reproductions, and because these are, highly sought after jewelry pieces. And so it only makes sense that we are going to see a lot of reproductions. But again, you will be able to tell once you know what the original pieces look like and feel like. You'll be able to pick up on a reproduction. All right. At least that's been my experience. But again, that does take time. And the more you learn, the more comfortable you will be figuring out, which is a repo and which could potentially be authentic. Okay. Now, the other thing we want to really, really examine and study is the craftsmanship and the quality. I've talked about this in previous podcast episodes. Usually, you can look very closely and tell that something is well made. Now, not always, but I want to say at least 98% of the time you can. I have learned this simply by handling higher end jewelry pieces when I have the opportunity to do so. Sometimes when you are at estate sales or auctions or at auction houses, sometimes you can handle the pieces and you'll be able to tell right away that this is a well made piece. And you can tell usually by the weight. The smoothness of some of the details, and looking at how intricate some of the design is. All right, so again, this takes time for you to acquire this knowledge, but it doesn't take, it's not like it takes a long time. The more you handle, the more you understand what really good quality high-end jewelry pieces look and feel like. All right, in determining craftsmanship and quality, you want to make the distinction between fine materials and commercial grade materials. Gemstones should appear lively and bright. Diamonds, white, and items with numerous gemstones should have excellently matched colors. All right, this also applies to pearls, which, our friend Matt Harris has taught us before. You want to make sure that they are well matched for color, shape, luster, and surface. All right, so I've mentioned Matt in numerous podcast episodes. He is my favorite pearl expert, and I will link that episode. If you're watching this podcast on YouTube, I will link that episode in the description so you can check it out if you haven't already seen it. Okay, so these are some things that we want to consider and things that we want to be aware of as it relates to figuring out how do we authenticate higher end jewelry pieces. Now, I do have some more notes here, and I do want to share some of these things with you. Okay, so that way you can kind of have a plan in place or even a system for figuring out, if something is authentic, if it's worth further research, or if you can determine right away whether or not this could be a reproduction, a fake, a knockoff, or whatever. All right, so we talked about examining the hallmarks and the signatures. That's always going to be our first key indicator about a particular piece. But remember, not all jewelry pieces will be marked. That doesn't necessarily mean they're fake, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not authentic. All right, we talked about assessing the quality of the craftsmanship. How well made is the jewelry piece? Okay, and so, I wanted to make sure my microphone was still on. And so we want to pay attention to those details, all right, because that's very important. And you can tell when something is very sloppy or just kind of mass produced, because a lot of the details won't be as sharp or they won't be as fine as with the authentic counterparts of those pieces. All right, now here is where I think all of us should get comfortable with these types of test, and that is testing the metals. All right. I probably should do a episode about that, about how to test, or, using those test kits. Now, sometimes some of those scratch tests could damage a piece, and I know that's why a lot of people tend to shy away from them. But you can use a gold or silver testing kit to determine the metal's purity. For platinum, palladium, and other less common metals, you might want to reach out to a professional to help you test those particular metals, because I don't know of any at home tests, or there might be some. I've just never used them. Now, I've used the gold and silver testing kits, I've used those, but I haven't tested any other types of metals. So, again, you want to figure out if it's worth taking to a professional to have it tested, if that's something that you are concerned about, or maybe you're trying to sell the piece and you want to make sure that it is what you think it is. All right, you can do the acid test. There's also X-ray fluorescence tests. And there's also electronic testers. Some of us do have some of these machines at home, or we have them, as part of our tools of what we use to authenticate jewelry pieces. So, whatever you, like I said, whatever you feel comfortable with and whatever you think is going to give you the information you need in order to sell that piece, make sure that you do that, or you pursue that, because it's only going to make you more confident as a seller, and it's also going to increase confidence and trust in your buyer if you can genuinely say, hey, yeah, this is pure gold, and I did the test, or here's the certificate that I got when I took it to a jeweler, or however you decide to do that. All right, now the other thing we want to pay attention to is authenticating gemstones. All right, now again, none of us are trying to be professional jewelry appraisers or authenticators, but you can kind of tell, the more you look at gemstones and the more you study gemstones, you'll be able to recognize some of the more, I guess, higher end, more valuable gemstone pieces. So you want to verify that gemstones are genuine by checking for inclusions, which can indicate a natural stone. Synthetic stones are often flawless and have telltale signs like curved striations. You want to make sure you're using a jeweler's loupe or gemological microscope if you have one. Advanced tools like a refractometer or spectroscope can also be helpful. Again, you don't have to spend the money and invest in these tools. But I know, depending on the type of business you're running, these may be crucial pieces to have in your jewelry reselling repertoire. Because I remember when I talked with Matt about how he sells jewelry on consignment, and he does these higher end jewelry pieces. He has all of these tools, because remember, the pieces he's selling are thousands upon thousands of dollars. And so it makes sense for him to invest in these tools. But if that's not where you are in your business today, don't feel pressured or obligated to buy this stuff. Okay. Now, the other thing that I think is really interesting to pay attention to is the provenance of a piece. And you want to research that if you can, if it's possible. All right, provenance refers to the history of ownership or the origin of the jewelry piece. Documentation such as a certificate of authenticity, original receipts, or previous auction records can greatly help you in verifying authenticity. Remember, sometimes jewelry pieces are considered valuable just because of the person who may have owned them prior to it becoming available for sale. The other thing is, sometimes depending on where a jewelry piece originated from, that can increase the value quite a bit as well. And so if you have the opportunity to research the background, the history, and all those details of a piece, it will only help you in authenticating it. Okay. Let's see. Next on my list is consulting an expert. I touched on that a little bit before. For high value pieces, it is advisable to seek, expertise of someone who is certified or trained in this type of thing, a certified gemologist, a jewelry appraiser. Sometimes you can go to your local jewelry store, even some pawn shops. Some of the people that work in pawn shops, I've noticed, are certified in this because that's, their business, and they may be able to help you out as well. So don't be afraid to reach out to a professional if you feel like it's going to be worth it for you to do so. Now, this is something that's interesting to me, and this is the use of technology. And this is becoming more and more apparent in the jewelry industry that I've learned about. And it's leveraging modern techniques like blockchain for tracking the origin of diamonds or advanced imaging techniques to analyze the internal structure of gemstones. So there is a whole tech tech side of doing this, especially as it relates to diamonds. And I don't know a whole lot about it. Like I said, I've heard a little bit about it here and there, especially at some of the jewelry shows that I've attended. It is something that is uh, very well, I guess, used depending on what type of jewelry you're selling. But just know that technology is starting to kind of make this a little bit easier for the average person, I guess, like you and me. But again, you don't have to do this. But if you are planning on selling diamonds or higher end gemstones, this may be something that you want to learn more about. Okay. And again, that is blockchain for tracking the origin of certain diamonds, gemstones, and so forth. All right. Now, one of the things you want to be careful about when you are authenticating your jewelry is be careful of scams. And I've done a podcast episode talking about the different types of scams and how to protect yourself, how to protect your jewelry. And whenever there is money, this is what I've learned. Whenever there is a lot of money involved, there's always going to be some type of corrupt, dishonest, shady aspect to that, because that's just the nature of how things are. And so you want to be careful that you don't get scammed when you are trying to authenticate your jewelry. And what I mean by scams is, be very particular about who you choose to work with, because if you have to leave your piece with someone for them to authenticate it, we want to make sure that you're going to get that piece back, or it's not going to be swapped out for something else, or they're not going to take off with it, or who knows what. All right. So make sure that you are doing your research as it relates to this, so you don't get caught up in any kind of crazy nonsense out there. All right. Finally, we do want to work with a professional appraiser. All right. Again, this is going to take some investment on your part, but if you're selling higher end pieces, it may totally be worth it. All right. So now I've never worked with a jewelry appraiser because I've never had really high end pieces, but I'd like to kind of move in that direction as it relates to my jewelry reselling business. And so I think it would be a good idea to start researching appraisers that you can work with if that is your goal as well. You may not have to contact them today, but maybe make a running list of people you can contact either in your local area or maybe online. If you have questions or you just want to get, a feel for, what you have, or maybe who can help you decipher, the authenticity of the piece that you are thinking about selling. Or maybe you don't even want to sell it. Maybe you just have pieces in your own personal collection and you want to know the authenticity of those pieces as well. All right. So I'm not sure if, because I know Matt was talking about how he kind of does this stuff because he's very knowledgeable about this. And so he would probably be somebody that I would start with if I was looking for somebody to kind of help me authenticate these higher end pieces. But again, I'm learning just like all of you. And so, I would probably start with what I know and then just kind of branch out from there. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay. That's just something to think about. Maybe not now, but down the road. All right, so following these steps, you can better ensure the authenticity of your high value jewelry, protecting your investment and maintaining the trust and credibility with your clients, because that's really what this is all about. This is about, us really being able to service our client or our customer or our buyer in the best way possible. And we want to make sure that our business is operating on integrity and that we are uh, listing pieces or selling pieces that are what we say they are, right? And that only helps us too to be more confident as resellers. Okay, so um, that's going to be it for this episode. And I would love to get your thoughts and your feedback about this topic. What questions do you have as it relates to how to authenticate higher end jewelry pieces? Do you sell higher end jewelry pieces, or should I say, do you resell higher end jewelry pieces in your business? And what do you do when you are trying to figure out whether or not the piece you have is authentic and real? I would love to get any tips. And if there's something I may have missed that I did not discuss in today's episode, please reach out, leave me a comment or send me a message. And let me know, because, like I said, I have no problem doing a follow up or a part 2 to this episode if there is more information that I believe can help us all. Okay, so again, if you would like to connect with me, you can visit the jewelryresellerspodcast.com. Again, that's jewelryresellerspodcast.com. Also, I would be so eternally grateful if you could leave me a review either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts if this podcast or this episode or any episode has helped you in any way, because getting the reviews really helps the podcast get out to more people so I can help even more people grow or start successful jewelry reselling businesses. All right, friends, thanks again so much for spending this time with me, and I will check in with you again really soon.